America has been tangoed once again as the orange one, also known as Donald Trump, returns to the White House. What does that mean for the UK government and geopolitics? We'll take a look at week one for new Tory leader Kemi Badenoch, who named her shadow cabinet and performed in her first PMQs. And as if we haven't had enough elections in 2024, Ireland and possibly Germany are now set to go to the polls before the end of the year. I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
She just looks like a bigoted woman.
Me and my friends sort of used to run through the fields of wheat.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
It will cost.
I know words, I have the best words, but there's no better word than stupid.
So welcome back to the Den, everybody, and Jim and I, along with our American correspondent out in Florida, Martin Liptrot, reflected on Thursday, on the election result from the United States, where Donald Trump didn't just win, but absolutely thumped the Democratic Party and stormed to the presidency, also took the House, the Senate. Looks as if he's going to have almost unfettered power. I said on Thursday that I was disappointed, although not particularly surprised. Jim obviously also offered a view. If you want to listen to that podcast, it is in the show notes, so you can click on and hear what Jim, Martin and I's almost immediate reaction to the news from the States was. Joe, I said on the podcast that you were either in the sea drowning or in a gallon of gin drowning your sorrows. So you haven't yet had an opportunity to comment on the result. You've had a weekend to reflect. What are you making of it all?
Well, I think, along with so many people, it was sort of shock, depression, despair and all of that stuff. Not entirely surprised that he won, but very surprised that he did it by such a huge margin. And I think, the Democrats have got a lot of soul searching to do. And I think it goes wider than that, Frank, because I think, the message coming through loud and clear is that, to be honest, people like us who are of the centre, of the progressive, of the sort of, more collegiate, tolerant, middle of the road to left politics, we sort of assume that other people agree with us, or at least see that that is a better way. And it is quite clear that that is not the case in America. I think, as everybody, many, many commentators have said, it is a very dangerous time for the world, not least because there is nobody around Trump this time round who's going to be anyone who's going to stand up to him and therefore present any guardrails. Because he's got such untrammeled power across all the instruments of state, he can do what the hell he likes. And I think that's frightening for us. But as I said in my blog last week, it presents a really good opportunity for Keir Starmer and European leaders to really bolster Europe and make it credible, so that we are not always looking over our shoulder to Big Brother Uncle Sam, or Big Uncle Sam, to come and bail us out. But I think, we're in for very testing times. And, we can sit here and talk about this, but God help the people in Gaza and Ukraine.
Well, we'll come on to the implications for the UK and Europe later, but let's just stick with what happened in the States. And I think that when you look at all of the polling that has been done, the exit polls, the commentary from an awful lot of American journalists, in the end, it is the economy stupid again. And, what we were all saying, in fairness to the three of us, if you listen back to the podcast when we've discussed the American election, is where Kamala Harris was weakest was on the economy. She never got a narrative. She never got a story that said to American people, look, it has been tough. It's post-COVID. We were coming out of terrible times, but we're back on track. And this is a staging post to better things ahead. And I think the irony, and Tony Blair and John Major may reflect on this as well, is that Trump will actually inherit quite a strong economic platform to move ahead from. So he will, of course, claim all the credit for whatever comes next if the economy does grow. That's assuming he doesn't fuck it up, and we'll talk about his plans for tariffs and so on as well as the podcast goes. But ultimately, it was that inability of Kamala Harris and the Democrats to focus on the issues that really matter, Joe. And I think you've hit on the absolute truth when you say people just don't care in the same way as we think they do about identity politics, about the sort of issues that, let's face it, the Democratic campaign did focus on. And the other thing, again, I certainly flagged this in the conversations in recent weeks, this idea that rolling out dozens of Hollywood A stars and entertainment celebrities is going to win you support amongst the people that feel disaffected is for the birds. So an awful lot of lessons for progressives, not just in America, but across the globe, I think, Joe.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one of the very clear lessons, and of course, hindsight and the distance of the Atlantic is a wonderful thing. But, when Biden was elected 4 years ago, the Democrats should have been looking for his successor. They knew he was old. They should have, whether they said to him at that stage, hey, Joe, make this one term only, but they should have been looking for a successor. And I mean, I think the same goes through all parties, actually. We saw what happened when John Smith shockingly died. We have seen it across the world where, for whatever reason, leaders suddenly are no longer there. And unless you've got a succession planning, and, now the Democrats have got 4 years, and we know Trump can't do another 4 years. So they need to be looking for who is going to take that battle if indeed the election is not changed so that actually you can't vote, which wouldn't surprise me. But I think, I saw something in one of the weekend papers and it said, pretty much the same that we're saying, that, what the Democrats did was they talked about people. They didn't talk to people. And that comes back to what you're saying, and Trump said, do you feel better off than you did 4 years ago? Well, no, if you're going out and doing your grocery shopping and you're not, it's as simple as that. And you don't really care about Bruce Springsteen or George Clooney or anybody else.
Yeah, it was Ronald Reagan 1980. It was Bill Clinton 1992, I guess. And Jim, it was the economy stupid. Nevertheless, I think that it would be too easy to simply say identity politics don't matter that much, because where I see progressive politicians getting themselves into real difficulties, getting themselves into tying themselves in knots whenever they're asked simple questions like, and I've seen this over the last few days, do you think it's correct for somebody who was born a man to be competing in women's sports and winning medals? And they go all over the place, don't really give a straight answer. When they say to a politician from the left, tell me your definition of a man. I mean, this is, or a woman, actually, usually is the question. This is something they've got to come to terms with, Jim. And if they don't, then I fear that it will start to chip away. And if you're in a close election, and I think that despite the fact that he's won by probably about 6 points now, it was still closer than it would have been if Biden would have stood, let's say. Yeah. So I think there was still a chance for the Democrats in this election. But that identity politics does matter. And as I say, I'm not suggesting that it wasn't the economy that was the big issue, but these issues that progressives think everybody just should fall behind us and just, nod their heads and say, oh, yeah, that gang are right. We've got to get to grips with that, Jim.
Yes. I mean, it was staggering that, as I said in the special podcast we did with Martin Liptrot on Thursday, that she wasn't prepared for the two questions that were bound to be asked of her about the border, where she said, well, I haven't been to Europe either, which was a disastrous answer. And then more crucially, and because I think this was partly the key to her losing, was her inability to distance herself from President Biden. She was asked, what would you change? And she actually said nothing and then stopped. I mean, I was talking to a colleague of mine, about how we do media training and preparing people for questions, and I can give you I can, what I think is a respectable answer that she could have given. So Joe Biden was elected in the midst of the pandemic in 2020 and had his priorities for the United States economy 4 years ago. And he has, in my opinion, done reasonably well. But I am my own person, and I will do this, this, and this for the economy. Job done, distanced, not disloyal, offering a clear economic alternative, because this is the big lesson, isn't it? It is the economy. And to a slightly lesser extent, we've had some disagreements on this podcast about this before, but immigration is an issue which is facing the whole of the Western world. And those are the two issues. And we'll probably come on to it a bit more in the future. But Keir Starmer and the Labour Party need to begin to learn the lessons from this, ready for 2029-30, because if they screw up the economy, they could be in serious trouble despite their majority. The other thing is, we've seen a huge number of elections this year, and generally speaking, even if they've retained power, like Modi in India, incumbent governments don't do well. It's been very rare to see incumbent governments endorsed by the voters. So it's very difficult if you're in charge to get further terms. Just on his appointments and so on. I mean, what's going to happen with Elon Musk is intriguing. The fact that Musk was in on a call to Vladimir Zelensky was very interesting indeed. I don't know what Zelensky made of that. But he has appointed this chief of staff, this Susie, somebody, I don't know her second name. Thank you. She's been working with him for a long time. And apparently, she's obviously of his mind and there won't be clashes. But she is an organizer. She will, because it was chaos in the previous Trump White House. So she'll bring some sort of organization. And, I think in these dark times, all we can hope for is that we have a coherent policy from Trump. Everyone sort of said, his strength is his unpredictability. Well, that's okay up to a point, keeping Putin and President Xi guessing. But, there's another side to that coin, which is that accidents can happen. So, a lot for other governments to learn from this, and we'll see how it turns out.
And a lot for the Labour Party and Keir Starmer to learn, because clearly, if they don't deliver, matters not that they've got this landslide victory in July and this big majority. People now will vote, basically, we're saying, in terms of whether they're feeling better off in the pocket. That's going to be the big priority. And then those other issues that we've mentioned, immigration, Jim, you're absolutely right. That is going to be a big one for the UK electorate as well. And as I say, I do think this woke agenda is something, I hate the word woke, but it's the one that people do bandy about now when it comes to these identity politics issues. And that's something, as I say, I think the left needs to give its head a wobble over, to be honest. So, Joe, Keir Starmer, now obviously and inevitably, the Tories are pointing to comments that have been made by Labour MPs, not least the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, who called him a racist sociopath, something that was a fairly accurate description.
Totally.
But nonetheless, how do the British government handle Trump?
Well, I think Starmer has done quite well so far. And I know Jim is not a fan of David Lammy, but David Lammy has been working behind the scenes for many months. He's actually created a relationship, if not necessarily a friendship, with Vice President-elect J.D. Vance. I think they went to the same college in America. They both have had similar upbringings in poverty. They both are religious. They're men of faith. And I think actually one shouldn't underestimate, and it may be that, David Lammy would be a better ambassador than a foreign secretary, because he seems to be very good at working behind the scenes. Now, if you remember that when President Trump was shot in the ear, Keir Starmer was the first phone call he took, much to the chagrin of Monsieur Farage, who couldn't get through, apparently. And also Starmer and Lammy had a by all accounts, a very sort of convivial meeting a few months ago before the election. I mean, I think he's right. You know, you've got to do the right thing. You've got to go through the how lovely, welcome to the neighbourhood. We're very delighted to see you. Don't put your bins out on a Wednesday sort of thing. But I do think there's a great danger, which we'll come on to in a minute. You don't want to be sucking up to him because the man's nuts. He hasn't changed and he's dangerous. You just go through the motions of being polite. I think the idea that, you know, we've got a special relationship is absolutely, you know, for the fairies. That hasn't existed for a long, long time. And I remember being in the States many, many years ago with Paddy and talking to somebody at the British Embassy in Washington. And he said, you know, when we need to speak to people in Europe, we love visiting London, but we go straight to Bonn or Paris. You guys haven't got any power. That was before Brexit. So I think Keir Starmer is wise to be courteous, and he is a courteous man. I think he's wise to show willing. And I think as for what people have said in the past, well, you know, Angela Rayner said Tory scum, didn't she? And Kemi Badenoch, who's been banging on about what David Lammy said 5 years ago or whatever it is, this is a woman who said, oh, free speech, it's most important. We shouldn't judge people by what they said years ago. So I think we can put that one in the bin.
Yeah, and I think more importantly, perhaps, is what Labour and Starmer now do with the European Union, because Absolutely. We are looking increasingly isolated under a Trump presidency. I don't think it's the UK that will be particularly picked on in this sense. It's going to be that Trump's just going to become an isolationist president, I guess. And so we need to start to get people around us who are allies and think in the same sort of way and who we can trade with. And guess what? There's this thing called the European Union that would be a reasonable start, in my opinion, in terms of having those conversations. Interesting today, Jim Starmer is in Paris for Armistice Day with Macron. And as much as we can rightly say the European Union, Brexit has been, without question, economically, whatever else you think about Brexit, an absolute disaster for the UK. It's 4% of GDP annually it's costing us. The Europeans will be worried as well, and they might see a close relationship with the UK as much to their benefit as to ours. It's an opportunity, Jim, is what I'm saying.
Yes, it is. Apparently, I'm subject to correction. Starmer is going to attend the Armistice Day events in France today, the first British Prime Minister to do so since Winston Churchill did it in November 1944. And if you think of what was happening then, we hadn't even defeated Hitler, but obviously the French had been more or less liberated. And Churchill was there, so it's a sign, I think, and especially with German weakness at the moment, that Starmer's identified that France is, you know, the strongest power in Europe, and maybe rebuilding our relations with Europe is going to be sort of a bilateral, trilateral thing, that we work out relationships with individual countries. But I think you're absolutely right, and in relation to Ukraine, you know, if we're going to have to take up more of the burden, then, you know, to be fair, from Boris Johnson onwards, we have been a stalwart ally of Ukraine. And that's, I think, how Starmer will play it. Will try and be diplomatic, be supportive of the French in particular. And then it might be easier to ease some of these ridiculous restrictions which are holding back our economy. On the more general thing of our relations with the United States, I don't think we can look for any favors. We sort of, in a slightly humiliating way, sort of cling on to this special relationship. Of course, there's kith and kin and there's history, and we can go back on that. But particularly with this president, transactional President Trump, he won't give a fig for that. He'll look at things pragmatically. And I think if he decides to slap 20% tariffs on everybody, he probably will. And then we'll say, well, I'll ease them if you'll let my
Coronated chicken.
Yeah. If you let that in. So there we are. I mean, the other appointment that's got to be made, of course, is the ambassador to the United States. Peter Mandelson seems to have got himself in a slightly difficult position because he's going for the chancellorship of Oxford University and is showing a bit of ankle that he would like the job in Washington. So we'll see how that. I think it probably would be a woman called Baroness Amos, actually. But that's, you know, that's going to be quite an important.
But she could go to the UN. I think the other thing is, who could possibly be America's ambassador to the UK? Could it be one person who has got a public standing but was actually born in New York? Oh, come on, Jim. Boris Johnson.
Oh.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, if you think that David Lammy's comments about Donald Trump were disparaging, take a look at a YouTube video that has emerged from the time when Boris Johnson was mayor of London, when he basically calls Trump an absolute imbecile who wasn't welcome in the capital. So, not quite sure that will happen.
Yeah, I think these just on this business about, because they've listed almost every member of the cabinet has made disobliging remarks about Donald Trump. And it is a little bit excruciating and will certainly annoy the left of the party. I know they're squashed at the moment, but you can just imagine what Corbyn, well, he's not in the party, but, you know, that Corbynite wing are thinking about all these things that were said about Trump, which are now being sort of unsaid. I mean, I don't know what the solution to this is. I mean, you can't, you know, we as the media are always asking people in opposition, well, what do you do? What do you think? And you do feel a bit more liberated when you're in opposition to say things. And then we sort of hold it against them. But I do find it slightly excruciating as they have to sort of extract themselves from this. And they have to fall back on this thing. The American people have elected this guy. It is our most important relationship, you know, in terms of the economies of the two countries. And let's just get on with it. I think probably people will accept that, except on the left, they'll just store it up and say, look, you know, what's happening with taxing pensioners, winter fuel allowances, and we're sucking up to try. I mean, I know Joe sort of resisted the word sucking up, but I'm afraid it does feel a little bit like that, but for good reasons.
I think that pisses me off is this idea that, you know, the UK, clearly we all know we've got to try and have as strong a relationship with the US as we can. And we champion we headline the fact, oh, by the way, Donald, don't forget what our foreign secretary said 6 years ago. And don't forget what this shot. I mean, for fuck's sake, you know, talk about shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah, exactly.
We are fantastic at doing that. And given the fact that the guy chose and selected a vice presidential candidate who actually compared him to Hitler, then I think, you know, this idea that Trump is so thin-skinned that he stores all of this stuff up and he wants to take revenge, it is a little bit over the top. And I actually think that the point that you made, Jim, transactional, that's what Trump is. And if he thinks that there's a deal to be done with the UK that's going to benefit him, or with anyone else for that matter, then he'll do it. Far more importantly, what is going to happen with Ukraine? Because again, if you listen carefully to what Kamala Harris was saying and other Democrats actually were saying, there was no guarantee that the United States were going to continue to pour billions of pounds into a war without any sort of endgame in place. And Zelensky keeps coming back and saying, give me more cash, let me use more weapons. But ultimately, there will have to be a negotiated settlement. Does this not just accelerate what was an inevitable process anyway, Joe?
Well, yes, I think it probably is, because I think, you know, they could keep going fighting and losing more people, you know, the wreckage of Ukraine and the cities and the cost of rebuilding. I think, you know, we have got, and I think Zelensky, to be fair, I think he has recognized over the past few months that there is a general fatigue and desperation in his own country, not least of all a sort of war fatigue around the world, with people going, hang on, why are we sending stuff to them when we haven't got, you know, houses or whatever? So I think there is probably an acceptance that the only solution is a diplomatic solution. The problem is that with Trump in the White House in January and Putin still in Moscow, it's very hard to see how or who could broker a deal that was acceptable. I mean, if you say, all right, you forget Crimea, which is probably, you know, one of those things. But what you've got to do, and this is where I think our relationship with Europe is so very, very important, you've got to have some security that, you know, Ukraine stays there and Russia does not go any further than it already has done. But then you've got, is Ukraine going to be allowed to join NATO? Well, one of the reasons they were rejected was because of corruption. It's very easy to paint Ukraine as, David against Goliath and all the rest of it, but they're not that squeaky clean. They have done amazingly. Zelensky is absolutely astonishing, and the people of Ukraine are incredibly brave in fighting for something that is actually on the gates of Europe that affects all of us, whether we like to recognize that or not. But, who is going to broker and have a deal, and who is going to hold Putin to it? Because if you've got a US that is very likely to leave NATO and certainly doesn't really rate it, and you've got Europe in fragments because of immigration, as Jim rightly says, and collapsing governments all over the place, who's going to be the body that actually makes sure that any diplomatic deal works? We saw to a certain extent what happened after the breakup of Yugoslavia, but that hasn't been a smooth ride, and there are lots of tensions brewing now all these years on.
Jim, John Healey has said today that he doesn't think that Donald Trump and the States will leave NATO, and indeed a number of commentators close to Trump said likewise over the weekend. He will continue to demand, and we think with some fairness, greater contribution financially from Europe towards defence. And the other idea that's been mooted, going back to Joe's point there about how do you secure the border of Ukraine, is a UN peacekeeping force, which would involve British troops, others as well. And that is said to be Trump's big idea. There won't be any American troops there, by the way, but there will be European troops. And again, Trump will argue, difficult to put a case against this in a sense, it's Europe's border, Europe should defend it. Do you think that might be the plan that he has in mind, Jim?
It's a very interesting plan because well, you've encapsulated the argument. There's this feeling on the American right that the Europeans have not paid their contribution and are not prepared to put themselves in the front line. So that might be a possibility. Joe, if I may say so, rather easily said, the United States leave NATO. Actually, if the United States left NATO, it'd be highly destabilizing, would send incredible messages around. So I think, they'll stay in. But don't forget, France removed its military command from NATO at one point. They might be sort of jiggering around, but I doubt if Trump will actually leave NATO. A friend of mine who studies Ukraine on a day-to-day basis, literally, could tell you what sort of minuscule troop movements there are and all this sort of stuff. Really thoughtful person about this, said to me at the weekend, before there are any peace talks, it's really important that Ukraine has some military gains, because, in a sense, we've got to force Putin to the negotiating table. If he's on the front foot, which to some extent he is at the moment, the whole tenor of the negotiations will be in that direction. So, and this friend of mine suggests that immediately Britain sort of gets a consensus with Kemi Badenoch and Keir Starmer agreeing to increase immediately sort of defense expenditure and support for Ukraine, and try during the course of this winter to get them to make some military gains, to put the Russians on the back foot and then go to the negotiating table. Otherwise, they're very much on the front foot. But of course, we come up against this thing that Trump keeps pointing out. We've loved our social security in Western Europe for years. We've pared back on defense spending. As soon as the Berlin Wall came down, we'll say, oh, we'll have a bit of that for the health services of the Western European countries, and that's where we are. And it is a question for the British people. We spend a lot of time, and rightly so, talking about waiting lists and all that sort of stuff. Is Keir Starmer, perhaps with the consensual support of Kemi Badenoch, going to say to the British people, we're in an emergency here? If Putin's allowed to prevail, by having a favourable peace treaty, he'll be a permanent menace, and we could all be threatened. And the last thing I want to say is, my solution is that Ukraine is immediately admitted to NATO. I heard them say not NATO, but we'll give them security guarantees. Well, I don't understand the difference. If security guarantees means that if Putin or his irregulars, because that's probably what it would be, start nibbling away again, what guarantees are we going to give? Are we going to fight them? So
we're not going to be able to join NATO, Jim. That's off the table. It's not going to happen. And actually, I think there's going to be question marks over other countries in and around that vicinity joining NATO, and also European Union membership as well. And if you look at the emergence of the right across Europe, then actually you can start to see why those conversations are going to be far more difficult in the immediate future anyway. So I think those sort of ideas of this massive European Union and extended NATO, I honestly can't see that happening.
Well, what do you think giving them guarantees short of NATO membership actually means then?
I think that the idea that Trump has got, whether we like this or we don't, and it may be unpalatable to some, but is a UN peacekeeping force on the border of Ukraine. That is the only practical solution.
Which is what you had in Yugoslavia, in Bosnia. You had the UN there. Yeah. You had troops from all over Europe and Africa and elsewhere. And as far as I know, many of them are still there. I mean,
I don't want to be horrible, but the UN are in southern Lebanon, and it didn't make any difference. I mean, I think probably if it was composed largely of European, Britain and France and people like that, it'd be different with great respect to the UN force in southern Lebanon. But we have seen UN peacekeeping forces swept aside in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and other places as well.
But Putin isn't going to accept
and they're
any
still
deal.
in Cyprus.
Yeah, Putin isn't going to accept any deal that allows Ukraine to join NATO. So that's his starting point, yeah. And actually, if you were to take Putin at his word, he would say to you the reason that war started was because of other Eastern European nations' ambitions to join NATO. And so we've got this huge military force on our doorstep, and little old Russia, as he put it, isolated on our own. And you guys just keep saying, yeah, come in and join us. So he felt under threat. That's his argument, Jim. So the idea that he at any point would say, oh, yeah, they can join NATO, it's just not, and we can have Crimea. That's not going to be the deal. And I think also, you referenced this earlier, what a bizarre conversation. Zelensky, Trump, and the guy from bloody X, Musk. It's just what's going on. So when people say to me, oh, it's Trump isn't that bizarre a president, well, come on. You basically got a guy who runs a social media platform and sends rockets to the moon on a call on what is, in geopolitical terms, one of the most crucial and important issues. Listen, I know, Jim, you've got to go in 5 minutes, so let me get your final thoughts on this American situation in respect of the Middle East. Netanyahu, is he going to be pleased? Is he going to be concerned? Is he going to be as depressed as most of the rest of the world are?
Well, it's interesting that there's an attempt by the outgoing Biden administration its remaining weeks to try and do something about it. I mean, we've seen this pressure from the United States, and I wasn't aware that Biden has any pressure anymore. Seems to have got the Qataris to sort of say, look, we're either for Hamas to political headquarters to leave Qatar, or that they're not going to do any more negotiating because both Israel and Hamas are not negotiating in good faith. I mean, I don't have much expectation that Biden can pull anything off in his remaining weeks. But the only thing is whether Hamas and Hezbollah do think that Trump is going to unambiguously support Netanyahu in doing even more, if that's possible, possibly hitting Iranian oil depots, possibly the nuclear sites. I don't know about that. And therefore Hamas and Hezbollah feel the need to try and do something in the remaining weeks. Because from what one can tell, Trump, although in some ways it's contradictory, isn't it? Because he wants to end wars and things, but he seems to be going to support Netanyahu and doing whatever he needs to do. And don't forget that Trump took the very provocative decision to move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. when he was last in his administration. So it looks as if he's going to be a big Netanyahu supporter.
Although he did establish the Abraham Accords, didn't he? Which was seen, I think, again, across the world as a positive step in that part of the world in terms of its very, very dislocated politics. Let's face it. I mean, it's such a difficult issue for anybody to deal with. Joe, what do you think Trump's attitude will be towards Netanyahu?
I think Netanyahu doesn't give a damn whether anybody supports him or not. He's got rid of the, vaguely moderate defense minister in his cabinet. He is now completely right wing. He is a man of, he doesn't care about anything or anybody. I think, one of the terrible tragedies of this war is that, for all the pleading, cajoling, begging, diplomatic efforts, that we have really seen how weak the UN is, and the number of women and children and innocent people who have been slaughtered, and the way that Israel has got away by saying, oh, well, we'll investigate. Oh, well, I'm sure it wasn't us. Whether it's shooting a convoy of aid trucks one by one, or whether it's herding people up and putting them in a refugee camp and then bombing them. I mean, Israel has behaved appallingly, and it is absolutely clear to me that the international community has got nothing, because the only way Netanyahu is going to go is if his own people get rid of him, which of course they were going to do before the appalling Hamas attack on October the 7th last year. So I think, I don't see an end in sight. And we also know that, Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner was apparently marketing plots of land on the West Bank whilst the war was raging. So, they don't really care particularly. But, in a way, it goes back to what you were saying earlier, both of you, what Jim said about having a clear message, and what you said about, Frank, about talking to people about what matters to them. If one of the burning issues of the day is immigration, the more wars we have on our doorstep, the more immigration there is going to be. So it is actually in our own selfish interests to make it safe and better for people to stay where their homes are than flee, whether that's from Ukraine or Israel or Lebanon.
Absolutely right, Joe. And on that note, we will bring the first part of today's podcast to a close. Jim, unfortunately, has to leave us. He's heading up north. He's going to be seeing me a lot this week. So Howard Bernstein's memorial tomorrow, Jim, and somebody who will always be remembered as a great in this part of the world, if not actually throughout the UK, who's seen as a fantastic local government leader everywhere we've certainly gone as Downtown in Business. And be nice to be able to mark his lifetime achievement, Jim, won't it, at that memorial tomorrow? Yes,
indeed. Yes, we all miss him, and God rest his soul. I mean, he, was responsible, along with the political leadership with which he managed to work very well, which hasn't always happened with chief executives and local authority leaders, to sort of really rebuild the Manchester that we see today. And his relations with governments of all sort of complexions was extremely good. So it will be a sad but a celebratory occasion at the same time.
Well, look forward to seeing you there, James. And that brings us to the end of this first part of the Downtown Den political podcast. After the break, we'll be talking Kemi Badenoch, Germany and Ireland. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to the second part of this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast. Me, Frank McKenna, and still here, Joe Phillips, former advisor to Paddy Ashdown. Jim has departed to start his journey up north for a number of events that he's attending this week. Joe, week one for Kemi Badenoch, how do you think she's performed?
Underwhelmingly. I think Paul Mason said it very well in the New European last week. He said she's taken mediocrity to a new level. I mean, she should have had everything going for her. First appearance at Prime Minister's Questions. She wasn't going to be treated badly because, as we've said previously, Keir Starmer is courteous, and she's a woman. She's the first black woman to lead a major UK party. All of those things are, good things and things to be celebrated. And she came on and she didn't talk about something local and relevant to most people in this country. If I'd have been her, I'd have gone really hard on farmers. I mean, whether or not you agree with it, or whether the government's got it right or not, the Daily Mail and the Telegraph particularly are having a field day. Farmers are going on strike. What, are they going to wait until it stops raining and then not plant something? I mean, that's a load of old cobblers. But no, she went on the Trump thing. She looked like she was sucking up to Trump desperately, and then she brought up the David Lammy comments from years ago. Then she talked about the government not mentioning defence in the budget, which of course Rachel Reeves did on several occasions. And then she had the temerity to say you shouldn't be answering off a script while she'd got her head down reading from a script. I mean, it was a performance that you might have got away with in a sixth form debating society if people were feeling kind to you because you might have been a bit shy. But for a leader of a political party, the leader of His Majesty's opposition, I don't think so. And where was Robert Jenrick, I wonder?
Yes, well, we'll come to a shadow cabinet picks in a moment. I wasn't particularly impressed with the performance of PNQs. Again, I was surprised because I thought that's where Kemi Badenoch actually would perform best and put Starmer under some pressure. However, George Osborne, I noticed, was saying that he thought the Trump thing was the right thing to go on. I just thought it was frivolous. And I think it was the issue to go on if you've got nothing else to talk about. But
or as your last question, but not your first question.
Right. You rightly point out, Joe, she's got a myriad of things that she could have been talking about as a Conservative opposition leader. You've farmers, you've got business up in arms over the national insurance contributions, you've got stories coming out from the hospitality sector about potential job losses and closures, and they're the things that really matter. So we go back to where progressives and the left need to learn from the American election, and it's talking about the issues that are of concern to the electorate. Well, Donald Trump, most people in this country don't actually give a toss. I know it exercises us greatly, and we can talk about it all day because of the various implications of that presidency. But for Joe and John blogs out there, they really don't give a stuff. So that question was a wasted opportunity. I'm absolutely with you. And we turn to a shadow cabinet. She's not been dealt a great hand because she's only 121 MPs to choose from. Only 41 of those, actually, I think it may have been, supported her in the leadership contest. Ultimately, they didn't support her initially. And then two of the bigger beasts who you would have anticipated would be in any shadow cabinet, James Cleverly and Tugendhat, have both ruled themselves out, said they don't want to turn. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So Jeremy Hunt, of course. So she struggled in terms of, as I say, the hand she was dealt. How do you think she's played that hand?
Well, I mean, if one was being kind, and frankly, why would we? Yes, she's got not a lot to deal with, but Claire Coutinho, who I thought was bloody awful as an energy secretary when the Tories were in government, has now been appointed shadow energy secretary, which sort of makes sense. But she wasn't very good the first time round, and now it appears there are allegations about her having had a large donation from bulldozer people, the bloke who bailed out
an energy company.
Exactly. So there's all of those sorts of things. I mean, I think Mel Stride is probably, I know I'm saying this because Jim's not here, I'm speaking for Jim on this, because he's Mel Stride's biggest fan. I think he's probably quite a good appointment. He's quite avuncular.
Chancellor,
he's a good performer. He seems to be quite, he knows what's going on. He's been around the block a bit. I think that's not a bad appointment. And whilst you can attack Rachel Reeves for her budget, the easy answer back from Labour is, well, you left us in this mess. So actually, I think Victoria Atkins I'm surprised she didn't get health, actually, because she was the health secretary on the outgoing Rishi Sunak government, and she did seem to have quite a good relationship. She did actually begin to talk to the junior doctors who were striking, and if I'd been Kemi Badenoch, I probably would have put her back in that position to shadow, but they've given her environment,
but
which
she was
again,
a generic supporter, Joe, so it's rumoured that she's trying to sideline people who supported Genrick into roles that are not necessarily going to be frontline.
It's a terrible shame, isn't it, that environment is always seen like international development as a demotion. And actually, both those things are really important. And environment, arguably is more important today than it was 20 years ago. And it may be that Victoria Atkins makes quite a good fist of it. She's got the farmers to defend. She's got stuff that she can lay straight at the door of Labour. But, on environment in terms of broader things like net zero and all of those things, I suppose that will fall to Claire Coutinho. I mean, it's not an inspiring thing. If I was Keir Starmer, I'd look across at that bench, that front bench, and think, well, nothing to worry about here. But you never know. You never know. The Labour government is still... They're still on rocky ground with an awful lot of backlash from the budget. There are still questions over small boat crossings and all of that sort of stuff. They need to come up with something. And while Starmer, I think, is doing a very good job, and he needs to go to Europe as he is today. And again, I would say, the reason that he's at that Armistice Day celebration, I bet you, is because of David Lammy working behind the scenes, which is how he got Keir Starmer to D-Day, where, as you remember, Rishi Sunak didn't go. So I think, he's doing good stuff on that level. But people on the street, winter's coming, it's getting darker, people really do need to feel something is changing. Because otherwise, although they're pretty bloody mediocre, Kemi Badenoch's lot will have quite an easy ride. Yeah,
it's all about delivery, as we've just seen in the US election. You didn't give Priti Patel a shout out, who's got the shadow foreign brief. Some people found that somewhat surprising, given her previous record when she was in government.
Well, yes, and of course she was sacked, wasn't she, for going ad hoc to have meetings with Israeli officials when she was international development. But, then she was replaced by Boris Johnson as Foreign Secretary, who then shrugged off his security details to go partying with Lebedev's father on a secret island, a well-known and well-documented Russian member of the Russian KGB. So, what are you comparing to? I think the trouble is, you look around, Frank, and you think, you actually wouldn't want these people running a medium-sized business. They are so mediocre.
It's going to be tough, as we said, because she's only got 121 people to select from. And of course, with Priti Patel, with Mel Stride, and I would say Coutinho, I would have put into a bigger job, actually. Good media performers, which is what they'll be looking for, certainly over the next couple of years. They've got to try and make as much noise as they can, stay relevant, get recognised, and Badenoch perhaps will be their best bet in terms of championing messages. And they've got, as I've mentioned, a few issues to go on, not least farmers and business. So it's not all doom and gloom for the Tories. So we will see how she shapes up in the coming months and if she survives years. Joe, two more elections that may happen in 2024. One is certainly happening, end of November. We've got the snap poll called in Ireland. This is all to do apparently with Sinn Féin's huge drop in the polls. So they've gone from 38% in the polls about a year or so ago, half now to less than half, actually 16% in the latest poll. This is on the back of a number of scandals that emerged relating to leadership members of Sinn Féin, and also Fianna Fáil, the ruling party, with this grand coalition. Basically, to put it in terms that our listeners would understand, it's like the Tories and Labour having a coalition to keep out the nationalists. That's the easiest way I can explain it. So that poll is going to happen at the end of the month, Joe, and it looks like we will have status quo, if I can put it that way. And Germany, which was due to go to the polls in 2025 anyway, the coalition there has collapsed. And it looks as though now Scholz is coming under pressure to call a snap election, although the Daily Telegraph was reporting yesterday, and I kid you not, that may not be possible because Germany hasn't got enough paper for the election. I kid you not. So that may be on hold. But the German election, and I say this without any disrespect to the country from which I originate, is a far more important and pivotal election because, again, if you look at the polls, and if we're to believe the polls, and why would you, in a sense, but this grand coalition that was put together could probably retain power, different personalities involved, and the Greens could get a junior role as well. If that happened, Joe, if we ended up with Germany and Ireland being able to defeat the populists and the nationalists, I think that'd be something we both welcome.
Oh, absolutely. I think what is stunning, apart from the fact that you've taken my breath away saying Germany's run out of paper, if indeed that's true. But
it was the Daily Telegraph, so
well, that's true, yeah. But the collapse of the German industrial model with manufacturing, and particularly motor manufacturing, is astonishing, and I think would have been absolutely inconceivable, implausible, even 2 years ago. And ever since Angela Merkel left office, Germany has sort of teetered between one crisis and another. And yes, they've got problems and concerns over immigration, but it's the collapse of their manufacturing and industrial base that has always put them in such a strong position in Europe that I think is quite worrying, not least of all for the economic impact on that part of Europe. And I think, it's interesting, isn't it, Frank? We could, pick a podcast from any time, any day in the last year, and we will probably be having similar conversations, but it's just insert whichever country, whichever leader. And I think everything at the moment is so very fluid, and we've got, Macron at the moment seems to have held off the huge challenge of Marine Le Pen and the far right after his snap elections in the summer, and seems to be, France now seems to be relatively stable. Meloni in Italy seems to be fairly stable. She's got problems as well, but she seems to be stable and seems to be willing to talk to other European leaders. Orban in Hungary, of course, is the fly in the ointment, very, very right-wing authoritarian. But I do think, what we're seeing is complete change. It's like throwing, something into water and it's just bobbing and you see where it attaches. And I think one thing we can say for certain, Frank, is that we can't be certain about anything. And everything that we took for granted about Germany being strong and, the liberal centrist movement would overcome the threat of Nazism or the right wing or fascism, none of those things are true anymore.
It's, as you say, Joe, a very fluid time in politics. And although all the polls, as I say, are pointing to status quo in both Germany and Ireland, until the votes are counted, you certainly wouldn't be putting your mortgage on it, would you? So we watch with interest. We'll do a bit more digging into both of those elections. Those stories really emerged over the last few days. So I've given you very much a brief reasons as to why those polls are happening, and as I say, indeed whether the German poll does happen this year or not is still questionable. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our podcast. I'm glad that we've been able to get through the second part without Jim Hancock, who, of course,
it was a struggle though. It was a struggle.
He's always good as Jim to sort of remind us of the stories that he's covered in the past, and it was good of him to remind us of whilst he was in Paris for Winston Churchill's visit on Armistice Day in 1944. So we do thank Jim for his contribution as ever. Thank you, Joe, and we will be back again next Monday for the latest Downtown Den Politics podcast. Have a great week, everyone. See you soon.